are Geelong, the greatest team of all. We are Geelong, we're always on the ball.
Welcome to Behind the Play, a video and podcast product of The Hoop Show that explores the lives of Geelong players past and present, as well as the off-field figures that are keeping us Geelong strong. My name is Paul James, and today, well, we're celebrating a little bit. It's we had a week off last week. We skipped the prelim recap and a cast an eye to the grand final because I think I was a little bit too nervous about it. But here we are, we're back, and it's because really there's clearly nothing to be nervous about. We're celebrating a premiership, and I'm joined by Josh Barnes from the Geelong Addy. How are you, mate?
Yeah, good to be here, but I thought you would have got sort of someone with a bit of a higher rating than me to the Premiership podcast. Really, you got all the ex-players and everything, and you go lowly to the Addy. But it's an honour to be here on a Premiership podcast like this.
No, it's awesome to have you on, and as someone who works so closely with the Geelong community and the club and everything, I mean, you're going to bring an insight that myself about 80 k's up the road definitely won't have. So I'm keen to kind of pick through and discuss the experiences of the last few days, the lead up to the grand final, the day of, everything that's come afterwards. We were talking about a little bit before the show, so we'll probably retread some ground a little bit there. But as the dust has settled, how are you feeling now? We've had a few days. As of when we record this, the parade was earlier today, so it's Tuesday. This is a few days ago by the time it goes live. But how are you feeling?
I think what most Cats fans are feeling is almost satisfied, I suppose. I think there was a lot of relief early on Saturday, but
yeah,
I think now when you think back and how clinical it was, I think like most Cats fans, I've just been diving through everything, all the content, all the little videos, everything. I just can't stay away. My phone's constantly in my hand, just looking up anything the Cats are posting or the AFL's posting. Please give me more. But yeah, it just feels sort of satisfying. How do you feel a few days on? I feel pretty relaxed and happy about it all now.
Yeah, it's been a little bit the same. I've been really just enjoying seeing the clips that pop up, seeing the world, and not just the Geelong community, but yeah, specifically the world kind of lose its mind over Joel Selwood's actions over the course of the day as well. From Levi to the way he acted with the Oz kickers to basically everyone he interacted with on the day was it was an incredible series of interactions that he had, and obviously the reactions on field and those sorts of things too. But I don't know. Despite all of it, I can't believe how I should be able to believe it at this point. It seems that it's just a given, but how incredibly selfless and not about himself at all he was the entire day. So, but yeah, like those clips seem to be bubbling to the surface the most. But yeah, I'm really just taking in anything I can from the club, from the AFL. Keeping half an eye on what's going on with all the trade, and I mean, things like trade radio and all those sort of things have started bubbling up, and it's almost like your football version of daytime soap for a while there, but it's interesting nonetheless. So it's just footy still. It's been good.
Yeah, it never ends, does it? We barely wait 24 hours before trade radio starts, and they're wall to wall with that stuff. But yeah, it's fantastic to see those moments with Joel on the field afterwards, getting Sammy Morford over the fence.
Yeah, Sammy was awesome.
Rooms, all that sort of stuff. It really sums you up as a person. That this would be a day for anybody else who's waited this long to be a premiership captain would have made it all about themselves, but he didn't think about himself for 1 second of it, which is just classic him.
Yeah, time and time again. Sammy was obviously the one that's probably gone the most viral of everything. But yeah, it was just the whole thing's incredible, and all credit to the guy. And I don't know, one day maybe he'll be on the show and we could talk all about it. But before we typically we would be casting an eye forward to the next game, but it's a good 6 months away at this point. So we'll have an opportunity to kind of dive into the grand final and talk about the ups and downs, the lead in, the day itself. Can't say there was too many downs on the day itself, but maybe the ups and downs in the lead up. The Max Holmes sort of stories, the how you were feeling in the lead up, all those sort of things. But before we get to all of that, let's kind of talk about your introduction to the game, to Geelong. Like, how did you come to find footy in the first place? Was it one of those cases where you were almost born with a footy in your hand, or did it take a little while to discover the game? How did your story with footy begin?
I think I would have been born with blue and white in my veins, that's for sure. My parents footy goers. My nana was a footy goer all her life. She used to bust through the doors at 9 a.m. before the under-18 started at Kardinia Park to get a good viewing spot over the Mooble Street wing at Kardinia Park. And then we've sat there my whole life pretty much. I started going when I was maybe 5 or 6. Sat on that Mooble Street wing. Now it's the Reg Hickey stand. We still have seats in there. I've been a member for 22 years now, so
Very nice.
I've always been a Cats fan. I think since before birth, really. It's been there was no choice about it. Growing up in Geelong and growing up in a Geelong family, and once I realised that my footy was never really going to go anywhere on field, I tried to do something with it off field, and
Yep.
now I'm finding myself in the room post matches and that sort of stuff. So it's
a bit of a
really
thrill.
true for a Cats fan.
Yeah, certainly. I think there's a lot of people watching and listening right now that are pretty envious of the access that you've had over the course of the last few days, and probably living vicariously through you and some of the things you've got to say about the whole time. But I guess you just touched on it yourself. You realised that maybe playing the game wasn't necessarily for you. What age was this that you kind of, I guess, came to that conclusion?
Oh, it would have been maybe 27 or 28.
Okay, right.
Maybe when I was like 12, I reckon probably it sort of started. I started getting a little bit larger and a bit slower on the field. So I think when I was 14, I wrote sort of a cricket pamphlet. I think that got an award from Cricket Victoria. And so then I thought I might be okay at this, that sort of thing. A lot of commentary, kicking the footy in the backyard. So you sort of get keen on that. And yeah, I always sort of wanted to be as close to the action as possible. And it seems to be the most sensible way to do it at the moment.
So it began with cricket, but when did you realise that maybe pivoting across to footy would be... I mean, obviously you had the love of the footy, as you said, from before you were even born. When did you kind of realise that maybe pivoting and taking those skills and something that was clearly working all right for you in that one particular case and transferring it over to the oval ball game, when did you realise that was maybe an option for you, a viable option?
We still do sort of all sports at the Addy, so it's not all just footy. I'm the chief footy writer, but we do cover everything. So it's certainly not exclusively footy. I just wanted to do as much sport as possible. I spent a few years as a regular journalist doing sort of a news beat up in Melbourne, covering local community news without any sport. And that just wasn't as fun. It's a bit too serious trying to do serious news and cancel. And
real news,
that's really boring and not that interesting. But going to footy on the weekend, getting paid to sit in the stands and watch the game, it doesn't really get much better than that.
Yeah, I can't imagine that feeling gets old. The fact that you get paid to watch a game that you love and would have, ultimately been forking out your own dollars for anyway, and then you get to make it your job as well. It's a nice pairing, I'd imagine, and something that never gets lost on you.
I imagine if they sold the tickets for people to go into the rooms post match, they'd sell for a hefty price. So for me to get paid to go down there after a grand final is really as good as it gets. That's a dream come true, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. And so what was it about? So again, when you had this moment in Cricket Australia, did you say? Not Cricket Victoria, Cricket Australia?
It's Cricket Victoria, yeah.
Oh, Victoria. When they kind of latched onto your piece there and you thought, I might be able to make something of this, how did things go from there? Like, did you instantly jump onto it, or did it take a little while to, for something to click? Was there kind of weighing up several different options still at that point in time? What was it looking like for you at that stage?
Yeah, I think that sort of set me on the path, I suppose. I would have been, as I said, maybe 14 or so then. So I was obviously finishing my high school and thinking about what I'd do at uni, and it was pretty much always wanting to do journalism at uni. So I think from that point on, that was a competition where you could sort of enter. It was sort of bi-monthly, I think, during cricket season, and I won one month of it, and obviously thought I must be doing something okay. I don't know how many entries there were, so I could have been the only one. But
I'm sure you weren't.
It felt like I was on a path to something, I suppose, and naturally at the end of high school, I decided to go into journalism, and always wanted to go back into sport, as I said, and naturally going back to my old town back in Geelong and going back to the paper that I grew up reading, it was fantastic.
Yeah, I can't even imagine what it'd be like to be able to, you obviously got the love of the club and then be able to dedicate your professional working career, still kind of somewhat on the outside, obviously reporting about the goings on with the club, but to be able to have that sort of level of access, to be able to kind of reach out and presumably almost get in touch with someone when you need to, if you need to. It must be a pretty good feeling, right? Obviously there's work that goes with it, but it must be a pretty good feeling to be able to just touch base and they know you whenever you reach out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there were some guys in the rooms on Saturday nights that we weren't going to full hugs, but there was a lot of arms around each other as we were talking to each other, that sort of thing. So it is a good relationship back and forth. It makes, I think it's a bit up and down as a Cats fan writing about the Cats. I didn't have much of an opportunity this year, but when they lose, you almost feel even worse. So you write a bit more scathing, I find that I do, than an impartial journalist would. I really get stuck into them if they lose. I haven't really had a chance to do that for 5 months now, since they haven't lost a game.
That's a good feeling, though.
Yeah, but otherwise, it is all coming from a place of care, I suppose. So you watch them more intently than you would if I was covering, say, Hawthorn, for example. I probably wouldn't watch them as closely, but
Yeah.
if it's my team and I'm covering them, then I'm going to watch every single second of it, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that we're always the harshest on the things that we love the most, typically. Our expectations might be higher, or the way that we might psychologically kind of respond to these things is very, very different to, if you don't have a horse in the race, like, say, a Hawthorn or something like that, though I'll admit in my case, I do have half a horse in that race. I desperately want to see them lose at every opportunity. And that's 08 still bubbling away in my head that fuels all of that. But, I'd imagine that's always going to be there to some degree, I'm sure.
Yeah, how many grand finals do you think we'll have to win before we can get over 08? Do you think it's even possible? I mean, we could win them all by 90 points like we did on the weekend, and it still wouldn't even make up for a second.
I mean, this particular person, who I won't name, has been discussed multiple times on the show over the course of the year. They're responsible for some heartbreak for us Cats fans in 2005. Again, I probably don't need to name names there at that point. You can probably work out it. I flat out refuse to acknowledge the person exists at this point. My heart's still broken, and that, despite what we just did to Sydney on the weekend, that hasn't changed. I haven't. I don't think I probably haven't had enough time to digest at this particular stage, but no, I still don't think fondly of 2005, and that still burns despite what we just did. Matter of days ago at this point.
Yeah, well, the worst thing about it is those games always get replayed, don't they? 2008 seems to be the most replayed highlights of any game I've ever seen. I always see the stupid Stewie Jew goals and that sort of thing, and obviously Nick Davis was one of the great finals ever, but it was also one of the worst finals ever, and I'm sick of seeing it. You can never get away from it, can you?
I must say, I don't see as much of 2008, but maybe that's just kind of time and place or luck of the draw or whatever the case happens to be. I certainly see a lot of the Kennett curse ending in 2013 with that prelim and the Sean Burgoyne goal at the very end there, because of course the very kind of iconic kind of arm spread run that he has there at that particular point. Like, I understand how it's great for TV. Don't like seeing it, but that 2005 one, that's still there, and I don't think that my hatred of Hawthorn off the back of 2008 will disappear, even if we were to beat them in a grand final by a huge margin next year either. But we'll see.
Yeah, I agree. Those sort of wounds never really heal. That's what we like about being footy fans. The bad things stick with you, but you also get days like we had on Saturday.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, is it one of those things where it almost has to take for the relevant club, whether it's Sydney or Hawthorn or whatever, for them to be in the doldrums for so long, similar to, say, like a North Melbourne, that maybe, sorry North fans, but for you to kind of almost feel sorry for them, that you can then maybe get over those things. I don't know, because Sydney and Hawthorn haven't been in the pits really ever since those respective finals heartbreaks they inflicted on us. But maybe that's all. Maybe that's what it takes. Like, genuinely, like, cellar dwelling for a decade before I don't know, sympathy starts to kick in.
Yeah, well, we beat Hawthorn for 5 years in a row every single time, and it still didn't make up for it. I was still more nervous than ever playing against them, and even this year I was a bit nervous playing against them. We lost to them, so it just never seems to go away. That team in the brown and yellow, you can just never get past them.
Yeah. I mean, everyone talks about obviously the Kennett curse and how great that was, but at the end of the day, it was bookended by a grand final loss and a preliminary final loss. So, as much as it's great that there's some incredible memories along the way. Tom Hawkins after the goal in 2012, after the siren in 2012, and Jimmy Bartell's behind, and all those sorts of things that came on along the way. But it's bookended by heartbreaks, so even that kind of doesn't really resonate like perhaps it could or should. That streak is something else.
You don't remember the round 15 game in 2010 that we probably won by a kick, because you only remember 08 and 13, really. Exactly
right. So it's a bit of a shame in that sense. But you joined the Addy in 2019, is that right?
Full time 2019. I did sort of a bit of part-time work on weekends a couple of years before that, but full-time back in late 2019, just as the final series was ending.
Yeah, okay. And so, I mean, these days you're the chief footy writer for the Addy. How is that? Obviously, you obviously just highlighted yourself there that you were doing kind of smaller gigs, part-time stuff, and obviously you'd done work prior to that in the city, as you mentioned earlier. How did that gradual build look? And obviously, again, to what you said before, you were working other jobs that weren't sport for a while there, which obviously didn't light the fire in you. But like, what did that gradual build to this chief footy writer gig at the Addy look like?
Yeah, it wasn't. I guess it was quicker than you expect. Really, you probably expect you go into the Addy in late 2019, and it's going to take some time before you work your way there. We're such a small team these days. Even when I started, we're just about double the size we are now.
Yep.
So, and once a couple of people moved on, I was the only one left almost to take up that position of chief footy writer.
You Bradbury'd in.
Yeah, you got to start. I guess start weaseling your way through, trying to write more and more Cats things as you go and you build until last year when I took over the gig heading into this season. So. It sort of feels slow at the time, but then it comes with a real rush once it happens. So you sort of think you're ready, but then you don't realise how many thousands and millions of words you're going to end up writing about the Cats in a season like we did this year.
Yeah, it probably adds up.
To end, yeah.
But then again, I guess I wonder what it's like if we did have a kind of a losing season, to the point you're making before. Like, you might be more scathing or harsher on the team in the event of a loss, which might mean that you find more words at the time. So. Yeah. Let's hope that we don't have any of a losing season for quite some time, but who knows what it'll look like if that time does arrive.
The good thing about being a reporter following the Cats is you can pretty much guarantee you'll be working in September. It's been pretty consistent for the past 15 years that you're going to be there and doing something in September. How long that goes, I guess, is up in the air, but there are clubs that haven't gone anywhere near that sort of length in a season for a long time. So.
Yeah, exactly.
No doubt about that. We would have been pretty quiet covering the Cats beat the last couple of weeks if we were, say, covering Essendon or Carlton, who seem to have done nothing for 20 years.
Yeah, and I don't feel sorry for those sides whatsoever. But anyway, so yeah, obviously, you've kind of come into the role in 2019. Last year, you got appointed as kind of that chief footy writer role, but in the middle of all that, and even I guess amongst you getting the promotion there was COVID. What was that like for you, trying to cover the Cats? There's no crowds. There's the way that people can or cannot access the game. Very, very challenging, even in a professional capacity. What was that like for you as you're kind of establishing yourself within the team, but there's this layer of complexity that's just not been there with any other form of writing you've had to do up till that point?
It was fascinating early 2020 that everything else seemed to stop, and for a while the AFL did, but they came back, whereas nothing else really came back. We were all stuck inside our houses the whole time, and footy came back, so it gave us something to write about. For the first couple of months or so where they did call it off after round one, there was a lot of retrospective things, top 10 lists from the past, looking back over all that sort of stuff, because there was nothing current to write about. And
starting to panic about how much longer you could do those retrospectives and list for.
Yeah, well, I was forced to take, I think, 6 weeks of leave, and obviously you couldn't leave your house, so there wasn't much I could do during that time off. But with no local footy, no local sport happening, it was pretty much all Cats when we came back into it. So that was all right that we got to get stuck in. I actually went into the hub at the end of 2020 to follow the Cats into the final series, and obviously all the way to the grand final. So that was a great experience for me to get sent in there. And that was an intense 8 weeks of my life that hopefully we don't have to repeat, but it was
fingers crossed.
Time. Obviously culminating in a disappointing grand final that year, but it was a great time being up there and covering them as closely as possible. You obviously, writing, you didn't get anywhere near as much access as you would. We didn't speak to a player face to face for it would have been almost 15 weeks there from the start of round one till after the season ended. It was a long time. Even being in the hub, it was all work on the phone, that sort of thing, which might have been easier for the players, but it made it harder for us to get those little insights, and you had to contact a lot of people over the phone instead of speaking to them. But otherwise, it was very interesting that sort of year. And 2021 was a little bit more normal, I suppose. But again, a lot of it was covering things from the couch and watching through the TV, and again talking to people on the phone. So it's a very different way to learn how to cover Geelong when you weren't there in person and not mingling with people every week. But it was 2 very interesting years, and ones I hope we don't have to go back to.
Is there, I mean, obviously the circumstances weren't easy, as you just highlighted, but were there some things that you've learnt from the way that you had to approach your work during that period that you feel like have really helped this year, when things have kind of been a bit more quote-unquote normal?
Yeah, I think it's something you learn pretty early, I suppose, in journalism, is just to make that extra call and send that extra text, really. We didn't have a choice in COVID, so you were forced to make any calls if you wanted to find anything. But sometimes you sort of think, I don't have to make that extra call, I'll save that for tomorrow. But you sort of really learn that you have to do everything you can to find out everything you can, I suppose, when you get the chance and you're onto a story or something like that. So That's something I think I've learned. Even now, still, I sort of debate sometimes whether I make that last call at 5 o'clock or whether I hang things up. But that's something you have to learn pretty early on in this caper.
And you're finding now in 2022 that more often than not you are making that call or sending that text?
I like to think so. Once and learning about the ins and outs of the clubs and who is best to send that message to, who should you bug with that phone call. Some people aren't best to speak about it. Some people will speak to you. Some people won't. So it's all learning, I guess, to try and find those people and work out the best way to approach each of them. But I think I am. At least if my boss is going to be listening to this, then I definitely do.
Good. And I had no doubt in the slightest. In 2020, you mentioned obviously you're up there in the hub, and obviously that was a challenging time for everyone involved. There's a degree of luxury once you're able to get out of the lockdowns and all of those sorts of things that obviously a lot of people didn't have. But to go there with the plan to cover the Cats, and obviously things were looking so good until grand final day. Hell, even halfway through grand final day, things were looking great. For it to end the way that it did, and we've obviously heard about how Scotty handled it as one example, and there's been little stories about how some of the other players handled the loss and those sorts of things. But for yourself and what you had to go through, I guess, to get to that point, how did you take the loss as a fan, but also in that professional capacity?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. At the Addy, we do a Sunday edition if we win the grand final, the Cats. So if you haven't bought one or got your hands on one yet, Cats fans, definitely try to.
Go do it.
It only ever happens if we win the grand final. We don't do Sunday editions any other time. So, and it also doesn't happen if they lose the grand final. So that 2020 grand final, we had everybody waiting on the printing press. It was a night game, so it was going to be, I think, an 11:30 deadline. And halfway through the second quarter, we're thinking we're on here. We're going to be writing about 30 stories after the game finishes. And then Dusty did his thing, and then we had to collapse and we didn't do anything. So everybody went home back in Geelong and went back to their houses and went back to, I guess, sleep. I wrote, I think, one or two things and then left the ground. So it was very, very different to what it would have been. So I think professionally it was, obviously I want to cover a final, but you're getting that sort of twinge of some tiny bit of relief that you're not going to be working through the night until 2 a.m. But it just sort of, it was a weird time because when a footy season ends in finals in particular, it is just over. There's no next week. You're so used to the rhythms of covering a footy team that you'll be there on Tuesday and you'll be there for the coaches' press conference on Thursday or Friday, and so you start planning your weeks around that. And when they lost a grand final, normally you're planning what you'll be writing next week. You speak to players during the season and try and save things up your sleeves to write during the week, but there's none of that. It's all over. You only spoke to Joel Selwood was the only player that spoke. Chris Scott did his press conference, and then they all went home. So it was a strange feeling going home and then just sort of sitting there and thinking there's nothing much for me to do. So I wrote a few things on the Sunday, and really I think I went to the pub that afternoon and flew home on Monday, and it was just all over. I was on holidays for a few weeks. So it just comes to a crashing halt, I think, when you finish. And we're seeing the opposite at the moment. It carries on for days and days.
To go.
Questions never end at the moment. So it is sort of really just pumping the brakes as soon as that final siren sounded and Dusty was lifting his premiership again.
Yeah, no, well, Richmond might also fall into that same basket as before with Sydney and Hawthorn. I just don't know if I can forgive that either, or Dusty specifically either. We'll see how time goes with those ones. So that contrasts obviously incredibly with what we've just experienced, what we are still currently experiencing in 2022 now that we've just won the grand final. It's only 3 days old at this point. What was the lead-in to the grand final like for you? Obviously, there's a lot of work that goes into that pre-grand final period. I think you were saying before we started recording, would you say it was about 15 days straight or something along those lines?
Yeah, something like that. I haven't really been counting myself. I think it was around 2 weeks, maybe a bit more.
And that's obviously a hell of a lot of work. Like, what does that sort of period look like? Because I'm sure there's still a degree of bracing yourself, because what if we lose, and kind of the access that you have afterwards, and that would apply at any of those kind of key points, I guess the prelim and the grand final at the end of the day. Since the qualifier, obviously we had our second chance. But what does that kind of look like? What sort of things are you planning? How many plates are you spinning at these various different points as you try to massage everything through to the end of the Friday night in the case of the prelim, or the end of Saturday in the case of the grand final? What does that all look like for you?
Yeah, it's interesting. You are sort of weighing, I guess, 2 alternate paths, or maybe even 3 alternate paths. That particularly after the prelim, we obviously have to start planning, and you have these meetings about what we're going to do grand final week, and as a fan, I'm thinking we shouldn't be talking about this because we're going to jinx ourselves here.
Yeah.
But you start planning and what you're going to be doing. So we did sort of 8-page wraps every day, which, to get technical, normally our sport section will probably be 4 or 5 pages. So we're doing 8 pages day after day throughout grand final week. Saturday was even bigger. Obviously, we had the Sunday paper. So you start sort of thinking about what you're going to have to be doing in that grand final week if they win. But it all could have been for nothing if Geelong lost that prelim. Sort of halfway through the prelim, and it was all over very early, just like the grand final. You start thinking about the next week, start planning what you can. I know, speaking to players, speaking to staff at the club, what the next week looks like in terms of Monday's the media day, all that sort of stuff. So you start trying to think about how many plays you can speak to, how you're going to keep the content rolling throughout the week. It's just all about moving from one thing to another. I think I realised Friday afternoon, heading into the grand final, was when I wrote sort of one of my last stories at maybe 6 o'clock or something on Friday, and thought I've been spending the past week just moving from one story to another, thinking about what the next story will be, and then there were no stories left to write. So I think it was only then that I actually started thinking about the game and what it actually would mean, and I started getting nervous. So it took me all that time, which is probably good for a fan, really. I didn't get the chance to get stressed all week.
Too busy.
It was just sort of one story after another until you're done. So that Friday night, I started getting a bit tense, but that whole week was just, I guess, endless writing and trying to get everything done and make sure you've done the best job you possibly can.
Yeah, I was kind of curious to see what that'd be like, because when covering the club is your work, but you're also a fan at the same time, I was curious to kind of know how much time you'd actually get to digest the win itself in the prelim, but then that excitement in the week leading up to it. And clearly, until the very end, you didn't really get to do that at all. But you consider that a good thing for the most part?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I would say I probably think about the Cats almost more than any other person, because that's what I do 9 to 5.
Yeah.
And most people think about it 9 to 5, but they still have to pretend they're working, whereas I literally just have to think about it the whole time. So it's interesting that as a fan, I probably thought about Geelong and writing about them and thinking about them the whole time, but I didn't really think about the game as much. Obviously, I'm writing things about the game, but I didn't think about those feelings around it that you get as a fan, the sort of nervous feeling in your stomach. So I think it was good. It means sometimes you don't get to soak things in, but also I'm there for everything. So I was there at the parade. I was there at training both days. I was there to speak to the coaches and that sort of thing. So I'm always there trying to soak things in, but sometimes you don't, sometimes you do, I suppose.
The work brain kicks in a bit.
Yeah. So you sort of try to, and you're supposed to be impartial. I know everybody listening to this realises I'm not completely, but you are trying to think about it in an impartial way and cover them in an impartial way if you can, a little bit. But yeah, I think it probably suited me as a fan to not really have to be weighted down by all that tension and pressure during the week.
Yep.
And I could just sort of focus on my tasks and the game. But it seemed to hit me on Friday night, and Saturday morning I was starting to sort of get a bit tense and that sort of stuff. But luckily it didn't last long during the game.
Oh, yeah. It was the same sort of thing going in grand final day, heading into the ground. I thought I was going to be sick for the bulk of the time. And I didn't want to say it at the time, like with the mate that I was sitting with for the game, but about 20 minutes into the first, I wanted to swing around and say, it's done, like we're good.
Yeah.
I didn't want to jinx it, so I kept my mouth shut until about half time, I think, at which point, okay, like we've seen off the little surge they had during that second quarter and still broke even in the process. Well, in fact, we built the lead by another point in that quarter, but I just didn't think they were coming back at that point, and I was able to celebrate a little bit. The day itself for you, what does that look like, though?
Yeah, well, you get in there, I guess, a couple of hours early for me, like probably most fans trying to get there. Obviously, the Max Holmes news was the thing that was floating around. Everybody was trying to get their hands on whether he's officially out or not, even though I think we mostly all knew he was going to be out from sort of Friday onwards. So you're trying to, I guess, get your head around that news and grapple onto that. And then really from sort of 1:30, once the teams go in, I was able to switch into Robbie Williams mode, which was nice for 20 minutes or so and not think about the game. But then it's all, I guess I'm thinking about notes. I'm taking notes, trying to look at all the players as analytically as I can and all the matchups and that sort of thing. But, from the morning until I got to the ground at maybe 12:30 or so, I was in fan mode, really thinking about the game and chatting to my family and planning out how we're hopefully going to beat them. And you start sort of talking like a fan. But once you sit down in the press box, you sort of switch into game mode. You open up your laptop and you're looking at stats and taking notes and trying to get as much of a critical eye as you can on the match.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that at least in the lead up you still got some time to enjoy it for yourself as opposed to through that working lens. And yeah, the Max Holmes one is interesting. So you were clearly of the mind that he wasn't going to play from Friday, or did you have that feeling earlier on? Like when did you feel like you knew?
I thought all week he was going to play until sort of Friday. Without having it concrete, it sort of felt that way. The way he got off the bus on Friday morning and he didn't seem to be saying, yes, I'm ready to play. It was sort of, it's in the coach's hands. And he didn't train on Friday, which I know he ran around in the morning beforehand, but that seemed to sort of be an indicator to me that he wasn't going to be playing. I thought Sam Reid wasn't going to play either. So
so did I.
That didn't seem like that was going to get up, and Sydney seemed pretty confident about that on Friday, regrettably for them. But it seemed like it was sort of heading that way. And the Cats decided Friday afternoon that he was going to be out, and Brandon Parfitt was told Friday night that he was going to be as the sub. So I think it's sort of you got that feeling, I think, Friday afternoon that he wasn't going to get to the line and he wasn't going to play.
Yeah, I remember seeing an interview and I couldn't possibly tell you, what outlet it was. I think it was one of the TV crews though, who'd spoken to him or tried to speak to him during the parade. And during that time, like they tried to ask and press him about whether he was going to play or not. And I noticed very quickly he was trying to dismiss and trying to get away. And that my first thought instantly was, this is one of those moments where if I try and stand here and answer, I'm going to cry. I need to get away. And because I don't want to be spilling the beans on what the answer is either. I need to get out. And that was my moment where I've gone, oh, yeah, this is not ended well. That was kind of my take at the time, anyway. So.
Yeah, it seemed that way, and it seemed, although from all reports out that he did seem to pass all the tests, and at that stage, the decision hadn't been made, and he had passed the test, so he would have been ready to play. But he didn't seem as emphatic that he would play, like most players would be saying. So. You just sort of got that feeling, and it seemed the coaches, when Scotty said at the press conference that they weren't sure yet and they couldn't make that decision, they said it wasn't a no yet. You sort of thought it's not really leaning his way.
It's not as convincing as it needs to be.
Yeah, it wasn't going to work out for Max, unfortunately.
It's a bit of a shame, but hopefully come 2023 he'll be getting another crack at it and hopefully gets an opportunity to come home with a medal around his neck then.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, at least 4 or 5 players have told us in the media that they're going to try and win one for him, or let's get back there for him. And
good.
If he sticks around, he signed a couple-year deal during the season. If he sticks around Geelong the way the team's been going for the past 15 years, he'll certainly get an opportunity in September, and hopefully he can grasp it.
Well, I mean, the way things are going, you're going to have Jack Henry, who's going to want to win one for his brother at this point, because it sounds. I don't want to, apparently the answer will come in the next 24, 48 hours to Collingwood, but if I don't know about you, and with the level of access that you've got, whether you're seeing anything different, I feel like there's a degree of maybe writing on the wall at this point. Even just the fact that it's taken until post grand final which is or after the team in question gets knocked out, that usually is a bit of a cue. But that's kind of my gut feel there. But
it seems that Ollie will probably, I think, request. I think he might be holding up because he might not be sure that Geelong can do it. That's going to be the issue because
right.
Geelong is keen to get Tanner Bruin in. I think Tanner Bruin's higher in the pecking order than Ollie Henry is in terms of what Geelong wants. And both of those players, their clubs will be asking for a first-round pick for both of them. So whether Geelong decides they are willing to give up both this year's and next year's first-round pick, that's going to be a tough one for them to give up both of them. That also brings up I guess, rumours floating around about Jack Bowles from the Coast that Geelong might be into him to soak up his salary and get a first-round pick back. If that is the case, it would be the highest pick they've had since Joel Selwood if they do get that pick in, which would be number 7. So that would be pretty handy to see what the Cats could do with that. But that would open the door to be able to feel better about sending away their own first-round pick in next year's to get in Henry and Bruin. But they're going to have to start getting rid of players, unfortunately. We're obviously recording this on Tuesday. On Wednesday, they'll announce their delistings. They're going to have to move on a few players because you have to have 3 open list spots to go into the draft.
Yeah.
Bringing in Bruin and Henry and Bowles, that's 3 players coming in. They're going to have to shift out quite a few players to make room. So it's going to be an interesting sort of week or so for them.
Yeah, I mean, the word's only out about one of those players, one of those 3 players so far, and everything else after that remains to be seen, I guess. And we'll probably have a better idea come tomorrow. I think it was Jai somebody that the club, in terms of the kids coming through there. I think I've gone blank on the surname, but Jai, someone from the Falcons that apparently they've got a bit of an eye on.
Yeah, Jai Clark.
Yeah, thank you. That's the one.
He played senior local football at age 15. I think he was best on ground in his second game or so. So
Oh, yeah, okay.
we often, unfortunately, compare players to the greats, but he has had Selwood comparisons. He's a tough inside midfielder. So
Apparently been working with Joel a little bit this year too.
yeah, and then the Cats always love anybody that's from the Falcons with a high pedigree. So I'm sure they've obviously got a strong eye on him. And he seems to be a player that would go in that sort of, I guess, 5 to 12 range in the draft.
Yep.
So pick 7's right in the middle of that. I'm sure if he's available at pick 7, the Cats will be keen. They have been keen the last couple of years to bring in midfielders. I think that's an area of the ground they are looking at to try and regenerate. I guess most of the older players are in that midfield mix at the moment. So I'm sure he's certainly at the top of their list.
Yeah, it's easy to see why, given the choice of Tanner Bruin and Ollie Henry, it's easy to see why Tanner Bruin is kind of the choice for that exact reason that you just highlighted there. Like, Ollie may turn out the better player, quote unquote better player, but it does seem like in terms of addressing needs at the club, that midfield depth and that next generation of midfielder is what the focus is at the moment. And so yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what's kind of required. Like if this Jack Bowes thing does play out, then once they've got that pick on top of obviously the pick 18 that they'll currently have, what does that then look like when you're trying to work with Collingwood and when you're trying to work with GWS on those two trades? Because maybe one of them will dig their heels in and pick 7 that you want to use for Jai Clark suddenly has to be an option on the table. Do they or do they not want to entertain that? It's going to be a really fascinating one, and it's crazy that a club who's just won the grand final can be in such a strong position going into the trade and draft period as well.
Yeah, and it is insane. Obviously, injuries may rear their head next year, but the depth Geelong had this year, if they're going to be adding some blue chip youngsters to their list in trades to what they have already, we're still unsure about what's going to happen with Joel Selwood. But apart from that, nobody else is leaving or retiring from their best 25 players. So if they add in 2 star 20-year-olds and try and draft a guy in the top 10, good luck getting games wrong next year. Yeah. There's going to be 10 unlucky players every week because they do have a number of players this year who are unlucky.
Oh, for sure.
Even in 25. So it's going to be pretty tough to try and get yourself a game for the Cats next year if you're on the fringes, if they can bring these guys in and what they have already. Yeah,
I mean, it's a good problem to have, obviously, for the Cats, but yeah, it can be a sad story for those who are perpetually missing out, I guess. But fingers crossed, ultimately it works out. We want to see the club be as successful as possible, and so I certainly agree that like those names that are being touted are going to be really important potentially to the club's growth going forward. So fingers crossed they can pull it off. How have you? So you were talking before the recording. You've had a few days off since. What have those few days off look like for you now that the grand final is over? We know the result. What have you been up to? How do you digest all this? How do you process it as a fan now, not just on that professional level?
Yeah, as I said before, it's a lot of reading everything in the papers, watching every show. I don't think I've watched On the Couch all year on Fox Footy, but I dipped my toes in this week just to see all the Cat stuff they had going on. I haven't watched a whole amount of AFL 360 this year, but decided to watch that episode this afternoon as well. It's been a lot of just taking in as much as possible. I think I've watched 3/4 of the replay so far. Geez, it's all good stuff, isn't it? You want to watch as much of it as you possibly can. It's been amazing to soak it in and take that time off and relax a little bit after the last couple of weeks. So
yeah,
I've been loving it. How many times have you watched the replay? Have you watched it yet?
I've watched the replay once since, and that was the one that like 7 televised the day after. I wanted to kind of, basically do it at a whim and watch it on KO, but KO was being a little bit precious about the whole thing the day after. I don't know if that's kind of some of the streaming rights stuff that's going on. I don't know where that all comes from, but like I really want, one of the things I really wanted to check out was a lot of the post game, the interviews with the players and some of the footage that was going on from my spot on the ground, like where I was positioned. You obviously know that the players kind of cut a lap around the entire oval. They kind of started at the bench and then made their way around to the race, where they obviously congregated and sung the song and all that. And I was awkwardly wedged right between both the bench and the race. So there was a lot that I was looking at, but looking at from afar, and didn't really get to take in the way others, fortunately, just based on where they happen to have their seat, got to enjoy. There was a few players I think maybe realised, oh, hang on, this section we've just awkwardly missed somehow and kind of trotted across. Tommy Atkins in particular spent a lot of time over there. I think he got completely lost by the rest of the boys for a while there because he just meandered on up the ground. But So I've been really keen to check out all of that sort of footage that's gone on afterwards, but Seven doesn't have it on their streaming, or at least they didn't at the time. And KO or Foxtel would have bounced back to their own coverage at the time, and so didn't necessarily have that, and that's not part of their stream now. So unfortunately, at the moment, that's a portion of the day that I was there for live, but there's a lot that I missed, and I'd love to really get to pull that apart and get a bit of a look at it, but I can't as of yet anyway.
Yeah, that was one part we missed. We went down into the change rooms after the presentation, so missed the lap of honour. And then we had to wait a little bit longer because of the Tyson Stengel debacle in the end with him having
That's a mess.
We were all expecting them to all come in, and he runs in first, and we're thinking, oh, here we go, all the players are in. But then obviously the TV that was in there with the Channel 7 crew showed the players were circling up to sing the song, and everybody was yelling at Tyson to get back out there. So we were sort of stuck in there under for a good 15 minutes waiting for the players to get in, which obviously they were soaking up the lap of honour. It's probably the best 15 minutes of their life, so they deserve to take as much time as they like. But yeah, we were sort of stuck in there, missing out on all that action as well, and sort of waiting for them to come in and get to us.
Yeah, and you got to feel sorry for Tyson Stengel. I don't understand what the thinking was behind that. Obviously, okay, he was scheduled to have a test or whatever the case happens to be, but like a bit of compassion, please.
I reckon you'd be able to keep an eye on him in the 2 songs he was going to sing before he has to go to the toilet and do his test or whatever. So I'm sure the Asada person could have stood there outside the circle like the rest of us were. I think everybody in Australia almost knew where he was, so they weren't going to lose him. He's not slipping out the back or anything.
Yeah,
that was just ridiculous. I've never seen it before that a player's sort of been directed to have to go so soon. I guess usually they've sung their song in the middle of the year already, so maybe they can wait. But it must have hit the time barrier or something. But that was just ludicrous.
Really weird.
Wait and make everybody wait like that.
Hopefully it hasn't soured. I mean, I don't think much can probably sour winning a grand final, but hopefully it hasn't soured things too much for him. The fact that he missed out on that particular portion, or a large chunk of that portion of the day, it's a bit of a shame.
Yeah, I'm not sure that Tice is much of a guy that gets upset about anything. Really, he takes it all in his stride. A bit like one quote about Collingwood's Ash Johnson this year. I think if it was more relaxed, he'd be horizontal. Is what's something they said about him. I think Tice is pretty similar. I don't think much sort of rocks his boat these days.
So it seems insane at this point, considering we are still just celebrating the 2022 premiership and trade and draft period hasn't even begun yet. But casting an eye forward to 2023, and we did obviously discuss, the impacts of a Tanner Bruin, of an Ollie Henry, of a Jack Bowes, and anything else, because I think I remember at some point Bailey Scott from North was also being floated around at one stage, maybe a month or so ago. That seems to have gone quiet from everything I've kind of seen and heard. But
yeah, he signed a new deal.
Oh, he did in the end. I must have missed that one.
Yeah. I asked the Cats about that one, and they didn't know where that came from themselves. So I'm not sure that ever inside the walls at Caninian Park, but it was certainly very strongly written that he was a chance to come there. And from everything they told me, at least, they hadn't really talked about him at all inside. So not sure.
Fair enough. Well, I guess that puts that one to rest in my head, and I'm sure in the heads of others too.
We do have to be the most linked club to any player, though. For a good while there in August, any single player that was possibly going anywhere was coming to Geelong, weren't they? I mean, Degoe and Grundy and the highway, all that sort of stuff. It seemed like every club was coming to Geelong. I know they don't mind that inside the walls at Geelong. They like everybody to know that they're going to be trying to improve their list every year, and they're sort of in the market for any good players. But it was a crazy hit rate for a while there in July and August. I think some journos are just putting Geelong in just so they had a second team half the time.
And probably just because it's a fairly safe assumption at this point.
Yeah.
It's one of those weird things. I'm sure inside the for the reasons you've just outlined, but even optically, like for players to be associated with your club, whether there's any truth to it or not, maybe then says something to other players who are, in negotiations with their respective clubs and do I, don't I, and I mean, a lot of the on-field success should carry the majority of the weight, but I'd imagine when you hear things like this, okay, Grundy's associated with the club, probably wasn't in the end, or very limited fashion. But as you hear this person, I'm sure that must be setting something off in the minds of these other players that are, discussing their contracts and their movements and thinking, well, everyone else seems to be going here. Like, maybe I need to consider it.
Yeah, I think the reports come from the fact Geelong does take those calls. I think some clubs wouldn't take them, and some players possibly reach out to Geelong trying to get down there and more success and stuff. I think Geelong does take a call and we'll give a player a tour or we'll talk to them and get the lay of their land. So it's never completely wrong that they are interested. Yep. How far that ever goes beyond one phone call is another matter, I suppose.
Yeah, fair enough.
I think that seems to be the path that they are always entertaining players, and we'll talk about them internally. And that, I guess, means they're being linked to, which is always the phrase, or Geelong is interested in these reports. So they are always trying to improve, and they are a club that has this proven track record of bringing in veteran players. Some clubs don't do it. Geelong will happily do it. So it seems to make sense. And I think players also want their managers to call Geelong and see if they're interested half the time as well. It must be going the other way.
Yeah, it's not a bad thing, I think, for the club at the end of the day. So, and obviously, bringing those external players from other clubs has played a big part in the success we've just experienced. So, not going to complain. Long may it continue. Long may it keep working.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been as many misses as there has been hits, I suppose, over the last 5 or 6 years. But given what we've experienced the last 3 or 4 days, you have to say that Geelong's strategy of not rebuilding has paid off. Some rusted on fans questioned it, I think, even the start of this year, whether it would be better to give up on it and go back down the ladder. But they've had so many swings at it. One of them was going to hit eventually. And now looking at their list, it's only getting better, seemingly year on year. So
yeah,
they're in a perfect position to keep trucking on.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many what ifs from this period prior to the 2022 grand final. Obviously 2020 is obviously the most obvious one for people because that was a grand final opportunity that didn't work out for us. But I think about 2019 and that prelim and Hawkins being out suspended and the what if that comes with that. Yes, Dusty turned it on again, but we had to send Lockie Henderson to full forward, and he hadn't been playing that role for a long, long time. It was clearly kind of out of his depth a little bit again during that prelim final, and you just wonder, okay, what if Hawk was there? You think about some of the games where we gave the team a great start, whether it was Sydney in the 2016 prelim.
Yep.
Actually, it was that one because the video popped up in my Facebook feed the day of the grand final because that year the grand final was the first week of October.
You don't want that leading into a grand final.
No.
But I agree. I think we're not far away from looking at this team as sort of winning 3 flags in 4 years almost. Since that 2019, it's been a different Chris Scott era. I think since the start of 2019, they sort of revamped their game plan going into 2019 and had Richmond on the ropes in that prelim.
Yeah.
And then the same thing in 2020. They were arguably the best side of the season and had Richmond on the ropes again in a grand final and just couldn't get over the line. So
just
they got so close. 2011, heading into that very last game of the season, at halftime they were up by 40 points against Melbourne and would have finished on top of the ladder and probably would have gone into finals as premiership favourites if that margin held on. Things fell apart from there over the next 3 or 4 weeks, and obviously they had 10 blokes sit in the preliminary final. But that's 3 pretty good years of success, and I thought heading into this final series, they'd gotten as close as any team apart from Ross Lyons and Kilda to winning a premiership in the modern era, really. They couldn't have got any closer than they did over those 3 years. And they finally got over the line. But it has been a team that has been so close for the last 5 years. So it's certainly not out of nowhere. And a lot of people talk about the oldest team in the league. So how can they keep going? Oldest team in history, how can they keep going? But they've done it for 4 years in a row now. So I don't see any reason why they can't do it for another 1 or 2.
Yeah, for sure. And so I guess casting an eye to 2023, I think the can we do it again question is, I think, a fairly straightforward and fairly resounding yes. I think from what we've seen on the weekend and the players that could be coming in to kind of top up and potentially even strengthen the list obviously means that we could just as easily do it again. But who are the teams that I think from what you've seen over the course of the year, who are the ones that we need to be most keeping an eye out for? Who's going to improve further? I mean, Melbourne, where do they stand? Do we think we've seen the best of them now? Where do you see the competition around Geelong sitting?
Yeah, I think the question will be, there'll be no doubt that at their best next year Geelong could win, and maybe coming into finals they'll be at their best. But heading into this season, they decided basically that they don't really mind where they finish on the ladder as long as they're at their best in September. And there is a risk that they could try and do that again next year and miss the top 4 potentially, and that would make things very hard because competition is always going to try and get better. I think Richmond, if they land Hopper and Taranto, are going to be a better side than they were this year, and by most rights they probably should have finished in the top 4 this year.
Oh, for sure.
They probably should have beaten Brisbane in the elimination final, and that's not far away from playing us in a prelim, and I would have wanted no part of that playing Richmond at the MCG. So
yeah, Dusty would have had a couple of weeks to get himself right by that point, and that would have just been a terrifying prospect.
It would have been nasty. So I can only see them really getting better than they were this year, Richmond, which is a daunting prospect. I don't know where Collingwood would be. my guess is they'll go down the ladder, given how many close finishes they had, that they'll probably revert to the mean a little bit. But they'll think they can improve. Melbourne will certainly think they can improve. They were really banged up in the final series, so
Yep.
they get a fit list going into the finals like they did the year before. They're going to be very hard to beat. Other sides are going to bounce back. Western Bulldogs have to be better than they were. I think Brisbane will have a sort of sting in the tail. It looks like they're going to get Jack Gunston in the door, so they'll be probably thinking their forward line might be even better than this year. Sydney, it's always that mystery that's been quoted so many times in the past few days, whether a side falls off the perch after getting smashed in grand final. But heading into that game, you would have thought they'd be better in 2023 than they were this year. So they've got to be a threat. There's going to be a lot of sides looking to improve. Carlton will have to play final, surely, after the year they had.
Who knows at this point, right?
Port Adelaide probably fancies themselves as a top four side if they get everything going. So nothing can be taken for granted. I guess it'll just come back to whether Geelong can, if they win their home games next year and finish in the top four, then there's no reason why they can't win the flag. But every year you look at it and think other teams are going to get better. Some of those teams I mentioned will have injuries or will fall away completely, but there's going to be a lot of competition around, and I think Richmond certainly is going to be one that's going to be fascinating to see how they front up come round one next year.
So what do we need to do to improve, do you think? I mean, and again, like that seems, on its own, that question seems crazy. We've just won the flag. Like, you're the best team in the world. But there's always opportunities to improve. What do you see as being some of the weaknesses there? And I'm not necessarily talking about players. I'm not trying to turn it into one of those kind of kick someone around sort of conversations. But like, where do you see there potentially being a vulnerability, albeit maybe very small?
Yeah, it's tough after winning a grand final by 80 points. And I think going into that grand final, most of us sort of thought there wasn't really a weak link on the field for the Cats. So I think the only question about them I had during the season was their midfield. They were a little bit up and down, particularly at the halfway point of the season. Putting in Blixavs and Atkins in there full time sort of changed that around a little bit. They put those two in there because they were a bit concerned. They were leaking things a little bit from position midfields and getting beaten, getting scored against. In the grand final, I think they scored their most scores from stoppages for the season against Sydney. In that first half, it really was just dominating from stoppages. So that was a question mark I had, whether they can dominate around the ball and get it forward and make that of use, because they were the best turnover side in history this year. If they can play like that, that's a certain area for improvement during the year. They pulled it off in the grand final. Otherwise, it's sort of hard to see, really. They've got enough leg speed these days, especially with Max Holmes back in the side. That was always a concern. There was always concerns about the rucks, but Reece Stanley certainly beat Tom Hickey on the weekend.
Yeah.
And Geelong is extremely confident about what Toby Conway can bring as a young ruckman. I expect him to be playing very early next season if he's not injured over pre-season. They expected him to play this year, so they think he has a huge future in the ruck.
Which is awesome to hear.
Their defence should really get better. I mean, Sam De Koning, if he's doing what he is in his first season of AFL footy, you expect he's going to get better down there. Whether they try and get a bit more height into their back line, will be interesting. Whether they look at playing a little bit more Osava Radaglia down there, he looked pretty good in his one game in defence. That seems to be one area that teams could stretch Geelong, trying to make use of your second and third talls, but it didn't really happen this year, but I'm sure that's something they'll be going to work on. I don't think there's much improvement you can ask for in the forward line, is there? So I think they've got most bases covered. I think the one thing about Geelong this year is they said all year that we want to get better next week. The next week we want to play better than we did this week. And even speaking to coaches in the rooms, they said that's what the attitude we'll come back with next season. And on December 1, when we start pre-season, we'll want to get better the next day and the next day. So Geelong certainly won't be slowing down. I would be very surprised if they had sort of a premiership hangover. They'll be looking to get better each week, I think. And I'm sure they'll come back with some ideas of how to do it. But there aren't many weak links in the game at the moment, are there?
Yeah, there's not many at all. I think the one thing, and to be fair, it happened a lot less the further we went into the season, though I did notice it once or twice when we played against Collingwood in the qualifier. Every now and then we still get caught on that slingshot play where we've gone maybe all in, chips in, and then for whatever reason, a poor handball, a poor kick, the ball bounces the wrong way, whatever the case happens to be, we can get totally exposed going the other way. And I think part of it is a byproduct of the style of game we're trying to play. But I can't help but wonder, what can we do structure-wise to protect ourselves that little bit more in the event that fluky turnover happens, or whatever the case happens to be. We might just genuinely be outplayed in a one-on-one for a second and the ball starts coming back the other direction, which is, it's going to happen from time to time. And it did happen against Collingwood, especially early in the piece. But I feel like that's potentially something that we could look at. And that's not a specific player thing. It's not, a particular region of the ground. It's kind of that full team defense sort of thing that kind of comes into it. But how can we just have that little bit of extra protection despite the fact that we are surging forward? How can we kind of structure that a little bit better?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see next year how teams treat Tom Stewart. In the back half of this season, he wasn't as good as the first half of the season since he came up from suspension. And I suspect a lot of that was teams really sitting on him. We saw Ryan Clark went to him in the grand final to try and take him out of the game. And he played all right in the grand final. But again, it wasn't his best game he's ever played. He sort of didn't have that same impact. But I think the Cats will probably see that coming a little bit this year. And in the grand final, they accepted it, and Zach Tui became the loose man and rolled off and played the Tom Stewart role, and they were pretty happy with that. So I think that's how they protect themselves from those slingshot plays, and getting more experience into guys like Zach Guthrie, Jack Henry, Sam DeConia playing as the loose, and knowing where to position yourselves like Tom Stewart would, because it is suspect most serious coaches would be trying to put someone on Tom Stewart next year and take him out of the game and see what that can do.
Yeah.
Even though in the back half of this year, even if he wasn't at his best, Geelong didn't lose a game. So it didn't really
the likes of Zach Guthrie, as you say, were really stepping up, and I think Zach Guthrie more than most really essentially played that role from the other flank. And so there's almost if one doesn't get you, the other will sort of thing that I feel like's going on at the moment, which is nice in that respect. But I think that's probably the only area I can genuinely think of that maybe we need to look at. But it's a very small thing, and it's not caught us out many times. But those one or two could end up proving to be the difference one day.
Yeah, my fear going into the grand final was how we handle pressure. I think that's been a bit of an Achilles heel in finals of past, where the opposition will come at us really hard and we sort of get caught in the lights a little bit. I think it happened a tiny bit in that first quarter against Collingwood. We sort of got stunned a little bit around the footy, but we just absolutely beasted Sydney in that grand final and did what other sides do to us to them, really. So if they can maintain that every week, they're not going to beat every team by 81 points, but if they can get through the pressure like they did in the grand final and play their style every week, then they're not going to lose too many games next year, I don't think. So that was one issue I had heading into finals, but they ticked that box pretty comprehensively in both the preliminary and the grand final.
Yeah. So a couple other quick questions as we start to wrap things up. And this one, who knows, we may have, maybe you even know an answer already, so I'm not going to try and extract anything from you. But if that is in fact some knowledge you already have, this is recorded in a vacuum. Joel Selwood, what do you think? Does he not?
I don't have any reporting for you, unfortunately.
Okay, cool. No, that's fine. I was hoping you wouldn't, so I wouldn't be putting you in any sort of challenging position there and trying to read your facial cues or any of those sorts of things.
It seems a lot of even the players we ask, well, at least they're telling us that they don't know. I think we'll find out more on Thursday night at the Best and Fairest. He'll be making a couple of speeches there, and whether he announces something then. My gut feel, if I had to choose, would be that he hangs them up. I think some people within the club, without ever telling him to give it away, would be sort of happy if this was it for him. This might be the right time to do it, but he has a license to play until he's 50, really. Given
totally deserves every game he plays.
What we saw this year is when he played excellently, particularly after breaks. Almost every game he played after a week off, he was outstanding. So if he is happy to play 15 games next year instead of 18 this year, then he'll go around again. I think the question mark for Joel will be not so much now. He might tell himself now, I'll go again, I'll play again, but it's whether you get back in December when the heat's at its hottest and you have to run laps for 6 hours, whether he can put himself through that, because he's not going to do it half-hearted. He's not going to.
No, it's all in.
Season. It's going to be all or nothing. So whether he has a few beers over October, November and realises maybe I don't have to go back and put the boots on and slog myself through a summer, I guess that's going to be the question. My gut feel at the moment is that he gives it away, but who knows? Knowing Joel, a lot of people have said that this is the perfect time to give it up and why would he continue, but the competitor he is...
There's a romance to that, yeah.
Why can't I do it again and be a back-to-back premiership captain? Why can't I make it 5 flags? That's probably his competitive willingness, but if I was to put a bet on, I'd say he will announce on Thursday he'd give it away, but who knows?
Yeah, I'm with you, and the main reason for that being that there was that. Obviously we saw a lot of emotion on the ground, and I totally understand all of that. The one particular moment, and it was splashed all over TV, and I've rewatched that bit back a few times, was the hug between him and Hawke immediately afterwards. And look, I'm no lip reader. I wish I was better at it. I've certainly learnt to read lips a little bit, considering I'm a teacher professionally, and I know when someone's cussing me under their breath. But it certainly looked to me like Hawk said, "What a way to go out."
Yeah.
So
I don't know how you're reading those lips, because he was blubbering all over the place, Big Hawkey, wasn't he?
He was a mess.
I've never seen emotion like that mid-game. The way he put his hands on his head, even kicking the goal on the ground, and 5 minutes later, when the ball was kicked to him on the outer side wing, and everybody gave him a standing ovation, and he
looked like he was going to choke up again.
There was still 5 minutes to play in the game, and the greatest competitor footy's ever seen was stopping to cry in the middle of a match. I've never seen anything like that from anyone, let alone Joel Selwood. So it felt like it at that stage. His family was in the stands crying. You sort of felt like he told them
it all adds up
that it'll be over. But I think if he did that, he probably would have announced it by now. I don't think he ever would have announced it on grand final day, because he doesn't want to make it about him, as we spoke about off the top. But I think he probably would have announced it by now if he decided 3 days ago it was over. But I don't know. I mean, it took Lingy, I think Tuesday was the day Lingy decided in 2011 of the celebrations. He decided that was enough for him. So maybe Joel's still making up his mind even as we speak.
Yeah, who knows? I guess, we might have an answer by Thursday, the best and fairest. I guess it all remains to be seen. And if he does go out, I don't think anyone's going to begrudge him. Why would you at this point? And if he sticks around, I think that's just brilliant as well. We get another year of arguably the greatest cat of all time, which segues into the next question I've got for you, which is the way we typically wrap the show up, with a few kind of shorter, sharper, more general Geelong-based questions. Who is the best Geelong player that you've ever seen?
The best, are we talking about...
The great? Let's say the greatest cat, because that way we can kind of encompass anything and everything.
I think the best, like, sort of single game performer, I think, has been Patrick Dangerfield in terms of the best absolute player. But Joel Selwood's obviously the greatest cat of the modern era. I think he's probably still behind Reg Hickey in terms of the overall impact on a club that Reg Hickey had as captain and coach. But purely from a player perspective, he outstrips Reg Hickey. So it depends how you qualify. But those two are the number one and the number two of all time for 150 years. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think, even though I saw Gary Ablett at his best, I still think Patrick Dangerfield's best game is better maybe than Gary Ablett Jr.'s in terms of an actual pure player. But Joel Selwood's overall contribution makes him, he has to be the greatest, really, doesn't he? Given what's happened in his 15 years at the club, it's pretty hard to go past him for anybody in the past 80 years since Reg Hickey gave it away.
Yeah, certainly. We've asked the question a few times on past shows with previous guests, and Joel's always kind of been in the conversation, but there's some that have gone with him, others that haven't. And I wonder what some of those people would say now that we've got this little bit of extra, okay, now he's a premiership captain, to add on top of all that. Does that push a few people over the edge? And I'm sure in a lot of people's cases, it will now. And obviously it's all a subjective thing anyway, but these are legacy kind of items, and I guess that Joel probably doesn't care that much about, given the sort of person he is, but for the fans, that does mean something. And so... that's a cherry on top.
It means something for their CVs at the end of the day. I mean, if Patrick Dangerfield had played on Saturday and had 2 possessions and won a premiership, then in 20 years they would look back at him and the first line in his CV would have been premiership player, even if he didn't have any influence. Thankfully for him, he was close to best on ground and was best on ground in the preliminary final and got the Gary Ayres medal as best finals player. So he shunned any doubts about it. But even if Joel had limped to the line and only had 5 possessions in that grand final instead of the 26 and dominated, if he had limped to the line and got his 4th premiership 30 years' time, would have looked back on it as he was a champion and he won them that 4th premiership or so. But the way he played even in it, and the way Dangerfield played when the heat was on, just shows, I guess, it does make their legacy so much greater that they managed to perform when it needed to be, to get Joel's 4th and Pat's 1st. Yeah,
no, I'd agree with all that. Another one for you. Gary Jr., Gary Sr., schoolyard pick. Who are you choosing?
Yeah, it's hard for me because I was born in '94, so I didn't see any Gary Ablett Senior live. I've only really seen the highlight tapes, and
much the same
on those highlight tapes. I don't like to get into these debates with players I didn't actually see week in, week out. It's easy to look back at the numbers and sort of think Gary Senior was the greatest player ever, and I don't doubt anybody that says that. But I have to go with the player I saw, and Gary Jr. was unbelievable, particularly those first couple of years at Gold Coast. He was just amazing. And I think, while I said Patrick Dangerfield was a better player than him, I think Gary Ablett held the belt as the best player in the league for longer than anyone I can remember.
For sure.
From 2007 onwards, he took it from Chris Judd, I think, in 2007, and he held it until maybe 2014 when he did his shoulder. I don't think anybody would have said. Buddy probably 08 probably tipped him for a year or two there, but outside of that, he had it for a long, long time. Nobody's had it like that. I mean, Dusty really only had it for 2 years around his grand final performances, whereas Gary Jr. was the number one man in the league for 6 or 7 years, which is incredible longevity. You don't stay at the top of the tree for that long. So he had a remarkable run, and it was a joy to watch him, wasn't it? Even in Gold Coast goals, it was still a joy.
Oh yeah, it was. Even when he came down to Geelong and would kick freakish goals, you just well, as a lot of people did on the day, even you stand up and you clap. Like it's just incredible what he could do. And yeah, I mean, I respect that approach to that sort of question as well. There's always lots of really interesting ways to approach it, whether it's just based on who do I deem to be the best player of the lot, or that pure schoolyard pick style. Well, if I'm building a team, I've got this plethora of midfielders versus the full forward option here. What do I kind of where do I go? It's always a fascinating one to see where people kind of lean.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you decide where you would want your players, I suppose. I mean, some people would pick Sam De Koning as almost the number one player in the league to have on your side for the next 10 years because he's a key position player that will end up playing either end of the ground, and you can pencil him in that he'll play 250 games as either your best fullback or your best full forward probably for the next 10 years. But is that more valuable than someone that's going to play midfield when midfielders win all the awards and everybody says midfielders win games? So it's a never-ending question, isn't it? And with Gary Senior, he was a forward flanker for most of his career, and then he wandered down forward to full forward in his past 5 years and kicked 100 goals every season. So you're getting a hell of a player to play in a few positions.
Just made a mockery of the game. Did both of them really?
Just outrageous.
Now, obviously, you just touched on Sam De Koning, and he's really part of the future here. Who is, maybe outside of Sam, because I think that's a very obvious answer for a lot of people, who is that future player that you are keeping a close eye on? Who's the one that you think, whether it's someone who's not gotten a lot of game time or potentially no game time so far, is there anyone there that you've got a particularly close eye on from the Cats going forward?
The last 4 weeks probably ruined it for me, given how well he played in the final series, and obviously we've mentioned him a lot in this podcast. I was very big on Max Holmes from the start. I knew the Cats were onto something when they traded up to take him, snatch him with that Richmond pick that 2 years ago. And I thought last year, well, he admitted he was a little bit overawed by the occasion sometimes. He showed what he can be, and I think he can be really an inside and outside midfielder with electric speed. Those kind of players don't grow on trees, so I think he's going to be a real jet. I think a player that we saw him once at AFL level that we haven't sort of seen a lot of. I think Ollie Dempsey's going to be really something special. That the things he was doing at VFL level, the belief he has in himself, the skills that he has. I think as a half forward flanker who can push up onto a wing, I think he's going to have some moments in a few years' time. I'm a big fan of Shannon Neal as well as a tall forward who commanded the VFL forward line this year and really was the focal point up there for 20 weeks. I think he has a big future, but unfortunately for him, he's behind a couple of blokes in that forward line at the moment, so it's pretty tough going to get a game. But in 3 years or so, when Hawke finally decides to give it up after he's kicked his 1,200 goal,
if he ever at this point,
yeah.
That's. I mean, the Hawke thing is a fascinating one as well because of the nature of the role he's always played and just the size that he has. You almost wonder, like, does that size alone add a couple of extra years? Because worst case scenario, not that you want it to completely upturn your entire structure, but I mean, let's be real, he's not necessarily the most mobile of blokes anyway. Like, does it get to a point where he almost becomes the stay-at-home full forward? Not because he's necessarily going to get up the ground and he's maybe not going to, completely rip a game apart like he still does now, but you can dump it on his head and he'll still kick 2 or 3 in a game. Like,
yeah,
who knows how the club chooses to play it in the next couple of years, and obviously it does create an impact for the likes of Shannon Neal and others that might come through, but it'd be really interesting to see how the club chooses to play Hawke.
Yeah, I don't know how many years he has left because he doesn't show any signs of wear and tear, does he? For a guy that 10 years ago was struggling with his back and looked like he might cut his career short, he hasn't missed a game since he missed that 2019 prelims through suspension. And he's been excellent in almost every single game. I think what works in his favour is he doesn't jump at the footy, so he's not getting any wear and tear from that. He's always ground bound. He gets defenders landing in his back when he takes those big chest marks sometimes, but apart from that, he doesn't get in the physical wear and tear as much. He just sort of shoves blokes to the side and takes chest marks. So there's no reason he can't keep playing. He does seem like a classic player who he could be playing local footy at 55 years old and still kicking a ton, just standing in the goal square, couldn't he? Like,
he fits that
there. Playing back at Finley, he'd kick 200 goals a year until he's 55 because there's no reason why not. If he's able to walk down to the goal square, he could plant himself there and just kick buckets. And he could do it probably at AFL level till he's 40, the way he's going.
Yeah, he could pull a Dustin Fletcher on us.
Yeah, why not? It's interesting that he's probably going to go past Joel for most games at Geelong, isn't he? If Joel
seems likely, yeah.
Hawk's only going to be only a handful behind him at the end of next year, and I assume he's got 2 years at least left in him the way he played this year.
You would think so, yeah.
And by that stage, he'll be not far away from 400 games. Really, it doesn't. Yeah. It
gets away from you very quickly.
It's not inconceivable he'll play 400 games and kick 1,000 goals, and that's just those are numbers that nobody's ever really reached.
Yeah, so certainly not as a tall forward. Like, you don't get forwards playing, like the big forwards playing that many games. Obviously, the 1,000 goals is obviously a very, very rare thing, as we've was discussed in depth when Buddy kicked his 1,000th early in the year. But yeah, to have that pairing of games and goals, that just seems like it shouldn't work. But yeah, I think the nature of his play does open up that possibility. So we'll have to wait and see. But it's a fascinating prospect anyway. And I'll be very happy if he's still out there in the blue and white hoops for 2 to 3 more years. That'd be awesome if he does.
He'll still be All-Australian captain in 2027, I'm sure of it.
Oh, and probably in his final year, he'll still be leading the goals kicked, the Geelong tally at the end of the year, because that's 11 years in a row now. He's been doing it every year since 2011.
I thought Jezza was going to get him when he inched in front of him in that qualifying final. I thought Hawk was in trouble, but then he just bags 4 and 4, was it, in the last 2 finals or something like that, to take the title one more time.
Yeah, and I mean, if he kicked straight, it could have been an even bigger margin between them in the end.
Yeah. James Podsiadly will have been retired for about 30 years by the time somebody else wins that award. It's been that long.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy at this stage. Well, that's about it. We normally wrap things up with the 2022 outlook, but we kind of know how that looks at this point. So
looks pretty good.
Celebration for a while, and then we look into this draft and trade period, free agency period, as it all starts to transpire in the course of the next week onwards. So, Josh, thanks so much for coming on the show, mate. And I'm thrilled to be able to chat to you about your career, your love of the Cats, and to be able to debrief on what has been a successful premiership campaign. It's been awesome. Thanks for coming on the show, mate.
Yeah, no worries, mate. Every time I come on, we'll win a premiership. If we guarantee that, then hopefully I'm on every year.
Yeah, we'll definitely make sure to lock this in as a scheduled piece of content September 2023, just to will another flag into existence.
Yeah, why not?
Maybe every week through September, just to make sure we don't want to hiccup along the way.
Lock it in.
Done. If people want to keep across all the work that you're up to, where should people go?
GeelongAdvertiser.com.au/sport. There's a Geelong Cats tab there. Most of the things that are written there are by me. Otherwise, go onto Twitter, I suppose. Josh __ Barnes. You'll probably find me. I'm sure most Cats fans have found me by now, but follow me there. I usually post most of my articles on there.
Yeah, if anyone's if you're watching the YouTube version as opposed to the audio version, it is right above Josh's head right now. So make sure to follow that link through to his Twitter handle and engage as much as you like. There's some awesome stuff going that you're sharing. I know that we were kind of chatting back and forth. I don't think you wouldn't have even recognised at the time, but before it was one of the finals. It would have been the Brisbane game, as the crowd was kind of starting to build up beforehand, and I was coming from quite a distance on that particular occasion. I was getting real edgy about it. I think you were talking about the crowd numbers, the number of people queuing out the front, and I was starting to get real panicky at one stage there. Turned out I had absolutely nothing to worry about in the slightest, but anyway.
Yeah, certainly not the Brisbane game, that's for sure. The Collingwood one, it was getting very edgy.
Maybe it was Collingwood. I don't know. It's a mess anyway. Actually, yeah, it would have been that. I was coming from work. But anyway, thanks so much for coming on the show, mate, and sharing this love of the Cats and all your work, and hopefully covering the Cats in 2023 is another successful year where we're talking about premierships and no injuries, Max Holmes winning a flag. We'll clean up everything next year. Let's take the Rising Star and everything, all that as well.
Yeah, why not? Let's do that. Pencil it in now.
Replicate 2007. Yeah. This year came pretty damn close.
We weren't far off.
Yeah. Otherwise, make sure if you are watching this on YouTube, please make sure to subscribe to The Hoop Show. If you're listening on podcast feeds, well, presumably you've already subscribed, but if you haven't, subscribed to Behind the Play on podcast feeds as well. And otherwise, this is most likely the last episode for the year. We'll see how things kind of play out there. We might do some little thing. Well, Ben will be doing plenty on the YouTube channel. I'll probably jump in for a bit of content there. But in terms of Behind the Play, the season is over. So that's probably us done for at least a little while. We'll try and bring some little guests on along the way and talk a little bit about that. So thank you everyone who's tuned in over the course of this season so far, the first season of the show. It's been a thrill to have you on board. It's been a thrill to hear your feedback, to have people suggesting guests. It's been great. Thank you for all the support. And until whenever the next episode goes live, remain Geelong strong, and I'll see you then.